Welcome today to our conversation on streamlining international e-commerce. My name is Chris Jones. I'm Executive Vice President of Industry and Services at Descartes. And with me today is David Emerson, Global Vice President, E-commerce Solutions at SEKO Logistics. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your role at SEKO?
I'm based in the UK. I've been with SEKO since 2004. Myself and my partners started SEKO outside the US as a startup in London, as the first office outside the US, and basically grew the rest of the world business, predominantly in ocean freight and air freight brokerage. But then very early doors, in about 08, 09, we got into e-commerce very early, both from a fulfillment perspective and from cross-border parcels, and basically it grew and grew from there as the primary business took off as well. Fast forward to 2020, SEKO is now owned by private equity, and I took on a role to run the global e-commerce business, which for us is our cross-border parcel business, our global fulfillment business, our returns and re-commerce, and our US two-man delivery business, which we run for e-commerce brands that need two-man and high-value threshold deliveries.
Well, you've been in it for quite a long time then, and I'm sure, especially over the last couple of years, you've seen just a tremendous growth in e-commerce and particularly cross-border.
It's been pretty insane, Chris, to be honest. Obviously we were seeing a lot of growth from probably 2014, 2015 onwards, and we were doing really well. But then obviously when the pandemic hit, the same for everybody, it just really went through the roof for us on our core trade lanes, which we have a lot of core trade lanes, not that many compared to the integrators, but yeah, certainly the volumes have really taken off, and we've seen significant growth into the States, out of the States, key lanes in Europe, Australia and Asia for us. And obviously it's been quite a challenging period to manage, as you can imagine.
Sure. And when you talk about e-commerce, let's maybe talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of the kinds of products or packages that are moving and so forth, and how it might be particularly different than traditional cross-border commerce.
We've really, in our cross-border parcel business, we've really got two kind of brands. We've got our Air City brand, which focuses on predominantly high volume, very high volume into the US, predominantly from China and the UK and Europe. And then we have our SEKO e-commerce brands, which are kind of what we call our end-to-end brand, which has probably a mixture of customers, some in those kind of low value, high velocity, but also more in higher basket values, and significantly sort of kind of bigger product. But yeah, from a commodity perspective, we've always been in the, we're very strong in fashion, in lifestyle, in tech, nutritionals, and fashion and beauty. Really, beauty, cosmetics particularly has always been very strong for us.
Right, and I would say for the average person, they probably are surprised at the percentage of particularly things like cosmetics and fashion and so forth that's sourced globally, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. People buying cross-border now is sometimes whether they know it or whether they don't, but generally more and more that they know. I think the consumer is a lot more used to it, a lot more comfortable with it, and obviously some of that is driven by lead time and the fact that the lead time velocity has shrunk so much, even through the pandemic, where initially kind of it expanded as air freight capacity was constrained, but people are now seeing that even if product is coming from China or into the UK or from China into the US on a cross-border product, generally they're seeing a reasonable transit time, anywhere from 4 to 10 days would be pretty normal. Generally quicker than that, I would say. Well, I would say that if we're doing it, but it varies, obviously, depending on how much you pay.
And maybe to that point, like, what challenges do you see associated with moving things cross-border?
It's become more challenging. The immediacy of the first one and the immediate one that is right in front of us has been just the constrained capacity on air freight, since the pandemic, with airlines restructuring their schedules and changes of aircraft. And obviously you've already had the change which was coming before COVID with airlines moving to more fuel efficient planes and coming off of wide bodied into narrow bodied, even for transatlantic, and that hasn't massively helped. But the big areas are really compliance and data, and restricted articles, the impact of the Stop Act and the UPU, and all of the changes to the postal networks that they're battling with, are having an impact on our customers too, as they look for kind of alternatives. So we see that data and being compliant is probably the biggest challenge that the customer has. It also becomes a challenge for us if the customer isn't compliant, because invariably they look to us to either formally or informally figure it out, but that's getting harder and harder as those compliance measures get stronger and stronger.
Do you see automation as key to this process, given the volumes that you're running?
100%. We couldn't do what we do in terms of volume without automation, without creativity on the tech side, some of which we have in-house. Big parts of we buy in from, as from people like your good selves, and yeah, it's a big deal. We generally most months into the US, we're processing 10, 12 million parcels a month, and you can't process that kind of high volume, high velocity without some serious automation, which we're in the fortunate position to have, as I said, both homegrown and outsourced. If
you took that and said, since you've been in this for a while, what has SEKO learned, about this kind of business, and then how are you really helping, your shipper customers? I think we've learned that, the more time we spend with the customers in terms of getting them ready is quite helpful, and trying the big customers, and there's always the element that the really big mega customers, they generally know what they're doing and know how to do it. It's that kind of next step down that's become broader and bigger, and a lot of companies that I think what we've seen in the last year is businesses that we would assume knew how to do this stuff don't. Right. And that's been the biggest surprise. I guess that comes from the background I've been in, freight forwarding before e-commerce. There was always the assumption that the shipper always knew what box to fill, because it was their responsibility, and that was how I was brought up and trained. That's the shipper's job, to make sure, and we kind of make that assumption. But I think things are moving so fast sometimes that even the shippers don't know how to do it. So I think that's what we've learned, that we need to spend more time helping them, and also trying to make sure that our tech and our stack and what we deploy to face the customer makes it easy for them where possible. And obviously that means a lot of interfaces and working with suppliers and partners like Descartes helps us. So would you say that I'll call it the victory is in the planning and organization up front, and of course execution ultimately matters, but you really can run yourselves into a lot of problems if you're not good to go before you press the button and start shipping? We are constantly looking for better ways of doing things that would facilitate the customers to grow, and that's across all of our businesses that we run, and the different departments, whether it's fulfillment or cross-border parcels. If we can make it easy for the customer, that's the bit that we've learned the most in the last the last 5 or 6 years of that e-commerce growth, is if it isn't easy, the customers won't do it, whether it's with SEKO or with somebody else. Given your role in dealing with everything from the UK to the US and so forth, you see any big differences between how the governments are acting with respect to these kinds of goods and so forth? And maybe I'll just kind of say one thing and before you jump into it, which is what we've seen obviously is governments really recognizing, hey, there's a whole lot of revenue that I'm not getting, right? That traditionally would have shown up in a container. And now they're like, hey, wait a minute. And we've worked with the Belgian government, or I should say, folks like yourselves, for processing in Belgium, in the Nordics as well, and it was all driven by governments saying that I need to get my fair share of this, and it's changed, and I've got to do things differently.
It varies. I mean, Europe and the UK, obviously, in the last 10 months, nearly 11 months, has been significantly awkward, shall we say. First of all, with Brexit, which obviously we were as a business, we were ready for it. We were, it kind of worked out as we thought it would. And I think for most companies, it did. First couple of weeks were a bit hairy, but after that, things kind of settled to some kind of new normality. And then literally 6 months later, you have iOSS, right. And all the changes to VAT, which actually was the one that seems to have knocked people more for six than Brexit, because it was kind of like companies had breathed a sigh of relief and were like, okay, well, our product's still moving, it's a little bit more expensive. And then there was this kind of like phony war of March, April, May, June, and then 1st of July, bang. And this is a really serious one. And I think that we found that particularly challenging. Not so much for us, because obviously so much of that was on the customer, was on the trader. It's on them to do. It's on them to get registered. It's on them to be compliant. And that's where we found that there was a lot of gaps. Again, getting closed. We're a few months in. It's like everything. People in logistics and supply chain always find a way. And I think that's been the case in the last sort of 8-9 months. With that's been with Europe and the UK, and I guess with the rest of the world, the US obviously seems to be, with the Stop Act and with all the changes with postal and so on, we're seeing a lot more businesses that would normally not want to talk to companies like us coming to us for solutions. Right. We're seeing a lot more of that because of the intricacies of navigating some of those channels that are becoming harder and harder. And it's just outsource it, pass the problem to somebody else, which is kind of how logistics works.
To me, what also I think gets shippers' attention is governments are fairly unforgiving. So yep. You do, the whole compliance process really has to be nailed down and be very consistent, right? I mean, you get either credit or penalized based on your performance over the long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a good point. They are unforgiving, and I think we saw probably a bit more lenience on Brexit and iOSS. But it took us by surprise how countries in the EU all had very different stances on implementation. Even though it was one date, it seemed to be that the interpretation was very much down at state level. And so right. Countries that weren't a problem, and for a few weeks were like, okay, well, this is working. Then all of a sudden it was bang, product's not moving. And that's been pretty tough. Again, it seems to be improving, but it's just that, that not knowing what's coming next is the hard part.
And you see that as also one of the things that you need to do to help your customers, is to really keep them abreast of those kinds of changing regulations and their potential impacts.
We're still very consultative in our approach with our customers. We're still very, very close with most of our customers, and we like to be able to help them and grow with them. So giving them advice, where possible, has always been in our DNA, and will continue to do so. We feel it's important. It's part of our job to help them where we can.
How about how Descartes is helping your business?
We have high velocity volume passing through, so many of our gateways, and we have a lot of data moving, and obviously we don't want to have, a cast of thousands processing that data, whether it be the exceptions or all the others. So, you guys have really helping us in those core lanes into Europe, into Asia, particularly into the US, and helping us build those solutions working with the government authorities, taking care of that side of the process, so we can focus on the bit that we excel at. And yeah, you guys have been a solid partner, and I think that, you know, as the growth has happened, we've kind of grown together.
Right.
It's been something that's allowed us to focus on what we're good at, rather than trying to tackle those things head on that you guys have the experience and the knowledge to navigate. So yeah, it's a good partnership. I know that it definitely changed with Brexit. We definitely upped our relationship with you when that happened,
Right.
when we actually needed to do customs clearances when we didn't need to before, and that's all worked out really well. And yeah, you know, I would say, you know, long may that continue. But part of me still wishes we didn't need to do a customs clearance with Europe. But, you know, don't take that personally.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. So maybe just a kind of a last question then, you know, for the folks that are watching, you know, what recommendations would you have for, I'll call it either companies that are full on into, you know, cross-border e-commerce, or really just getting into it?
I think data and compliance, you know, the full set of data has changed, you know, and it continues to change, where the postal avenue would allow you just to, you know, put a sticker on a box and throw it into a sack to get it into country. Is, you know, it's not behind us, but it's not going to be long before it's behind us. So it all comes down to the data. And I guess that, you know, what we've seen is, and as we know with e-commerce, you know, when product is sold on a tech platform, the data is available. You know, the customers have the data. They just need to spend some time on making sure that it's exportable, and
Right.
that it's available for companies like us to be able to do what we need to do with it. Because and if it isn't available for whatever reason, spend some time beforehand, before getting into a new market, to make sure that product doesn't get into that market that shouldn't be there or isn't compliant. Because, as I said earlier, it's pretty difficult to rewind. We're seeing, you know, us, and I'm sure I know many of our competitors are seeing growth into markets that we never saw 2 or 3 years ago. I think retailers and e-tailers are generally being quite bold, and trying and testing new things. But yeah, it just comes down to being ready, and not trying to think, okay, well, let's give it a whirl and see what happens. Because, to your point, Chris, you know, government agencies are fairly unforgiving. You know, they don't give you 2 or 3 attempts to get it right.
That's the trend that we've seen. I think really two of them there. One is, it's amazing how many companies are now really fully engaged, and even smaller organizations that are getting into it, and going, let's call it direct to consumer from their sources. So I think that's going to continue to, without a doubt, take off. And then the other part of it clearly is that whole, you know, like I said, the process and the reliability and so forth. And governments, they're in a learning mode. You know, you made the comment about, hey, you know, things are changing. You know, from what we can see, is they're going to continue to change as governments see, you know, whether it's a combination of, am I getting all the revenue I need to get or think I should get, to streamlining processes, deciding what data they really need or don't need. You know, all that kind of stuff like that. So, you know, I think this is going to be an absolutely interesting space for really quite a while here. We've certainly learned quite a bit from your team as well. So
good, thank you.
Yeah. Well, with that, I'd like to bring this to an end. And Dave, thank you for taking the time. Again, Dave Emerson from SEKO Logistics. This is again Chris Jones from Descartes. Thanks for watching.